Opening the king's diagonal immediately aims for central influence and quick piece development. Opens a diagonal for the queen and prepares to fight for the center's central squares. Unlocking diagonals for the bishop and preparing kingside castling are immediate benefits. Asserting central influence. This knight solidifies black's foothold and prepares for further skirmishes. Exploiting the center immediately. White opens lines and challenges black's pawn structure, aiming for active piece play. Opening the central files for immediate counterplay. Black surrenders the pawn advantage for dynamic piece activity. Reclaiming the center with the knight instantly challenges black's central presence and prepares for rapid development. Developing the knight here contests the center and prepares castling, maintaining the game's dynamic tension. Asserting central influence. White prepares to develop the kingside rapidly and pressure the queenside pawn structure. Black prepares to fianchetto their bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and bolster their kingside. Asserting central influence and preparing to castle. This piece creates a solid pawn structure and eyes the queenside. Developing the bishop to g7 activates this piece, aiming it towards the queenside where white's king currently resides, simultaneously preparing to castle and completing the fianchetto formation that characterizes the Sicilian dragon. Unlocking the kingside diagonal. This bishop now eyes f7, creating a subtle pressure point that could blossom into tactical opportunities or force black into defensive concessions. Challenging the strong bishop. This knight maneuvers to the edge, a bold gambit for initiative that might disrupt white's central dominance and potentially create outpost opportunities. Seeking to solidify the bishop's influence on the kingside. This retreat avoids immediate tactical confrontation and prepares for a potential kingside pawn storm, while also freeing the d1 square for future queen development or a rook maneuver to the central files. Securing the king now makes perfect sense. A vital step before venturing further into the center or flank. This prepares for potential future pawn breaks and allows knights to redeploy with greater safety. The immediate future hinges on white's response. Will they challenge the center, or try to exploit the uncastled king's former territory? Castling to safety. White solidifies the king's position, a crucial step before venturing further into the complex middle game arising from this open Sicilian. The king now enjoys a more protected haven, allowing the pieces to be redeployed more aggressively. Black boldly challenges the center, disrupting white's pawn structure and opening lines for his pieces. A dynamic response to white's solid development. Opening the central d-file with this capture immediately challenges black's pawn structure and opens lines for white's rook, potentially creating attacking opportunities. It forces black to make a decision about how to regain their central presence and whether to maintain their current piece development. Challenging the central pawn structure. This knight leap aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and activate a long dormant piece, potentially opening lines for counterplay. By capturing the knight on d5, white is initiating a pawn chain dynamic, sacrificing material for immediate piece activity and aiming to exploit the isolated queen's pawn that black will likely create. This exchange opens up the e-file for white's rook, creating potential pressure down the center, and forces black to confront an immediate decision regarding their pawn structure, which could lead to a slightly less harmonious development of their pieces. Unveiling the queen to secure the central pawn recaptures the tension from the prior exchanges, immediately challenging white's knight and aiming to disrupt white's planned piece development. This aggressive queen deployment, while active, does expose her to potential early skirmishes, requiring careful consideration of subsequent piece maneuvers to ensure her safety and maximize her Influence. Stepping the knight to b5 aggressively targets the queen and threatens to disrupt black's well-established central pawn structure, potentially opening lines for future attack. Trading off the queen in this position simplifies the material balance, steering the game towards an endgame where black's active knights might pose a threat to white's potentially exposed kingside pawn structure if not handled carefully. Securing the open d-file with the rook, white aims to establish immediate central pressure, preparing for a potential advance of the central pawns or to exploit any weaknesses that may arise in black's now rather exposed monarch. Navigating a tense central pawn structure after the exchange, this knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to pressure white's isolated d-pawn and potentially contribute to a queenside initiative by eyeing the c4 square should it become undefended, solidifying the d4 pawn's advance and preparing to exert pressure on the central files. This maneuver subtly curbs black's piece activity, pushing the pawn to a6. Black initiates a pawn lever designed to dislodge white's knight from its advanced b5 outpost, potentially disrupting the harmonious development of white's pieces and opening a diagonal for the bishop on c8. This seemingly modest advance carries significant strategic weight, aiming to reclaim space and improve piece mobility on the queenside, all while initiating a subtle but crucial positional struggle for control of key squares. The knight's audacious leap to c7 sets a fascinating tactical trap, daring black to ignore the looming threat on the b5 pawn and the potential for a powerful rook invasion via the open file. This creates immediate positional discomfort for black, forcing them to react defensively rather than pursue their own constructive plans. A classic example of initiative dictating the game's flow. Preparing to reclaim central space, the rook maneuvers from the exposed d-file to a more secure post on b8, aiming to support the eventual advance of the b-pawn and contest the semi-open c-file. This bishop's outpost on c5 seizes control of the long diagonal, directly challenging black's queenside pawn structure and threatening to infiltrate deeper into enemy territory. Emerging from that complex middle-game skirmish, black chooses to bolster its central presence and prepare for eventual piece deployment. The knight's relocation to d5 fundamentally alters the dynamic, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially open lines towards their castled king by forcing exchanges. This move, advancing the bishop to the weakened kingside, is a key defensive maneuver aiming to consolidate the position after the rook exchange and contest the now somewhat isolated d5 square, while also preparing for potential pawn pushes in the center. Reasserting central influence is key, aiming to reclaim the d5 square and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. The clearing of the d5 square by black's bishop exchange, though seemingly simple, fundamentally alters the dynamic, opening a temporary but crucial corridor for white's queen to potentially infiltrate the queenside. Reclaiming the exchange immediately shores up the kingside pawn structure and prepares to contest central space, a crucial pivot point as the queens depart the board. The knight's repositioning to f6 aims to recapture central influence and bolster the pawn chain, though it leaves the e7 square vulnerable to potential future incursions if white can orchestrate a swift attack. Establishing dominion over the central files is paramount, and this redeployment of the rook aims to achieve just that, preparing for a potential breakthrough or to exert pressure on black's somewhat passive pawn structure. Black aims to activate the rook and challenge the open file, a crucial battleground in this symmetrical pawn structure. A fascinating strategic shift. White reclaims crucial central space and prepares to dominate the d-file. leveraging the bishop's influence to pin black's potentially isolated queen's rook. Reclaiming central influence. The knight's journey to the king's flank initiates a promising maneuver to disrupt white's bishop pair dominance and potentially target the weakened kingside. Reclaiming the bishop's influence on the light squares. This move aims to solidify white's control over the central dark squares and prepare for potential pawn advances. Unlocking the c-file is paramount, as black now aims to activate the rook and challenge white's central pawn structure before it becomes too entrenched. Repositioning the rook to the d-file establishes a stronger presence, aiming to eventually double rooks or exert pressure along the open file, while simultaneously preparing to challenge black's control of the d6 pawn and potentially support a d5 pawn push if the opportunity arises. The black knight, having retreated from its active post, now aims to reposition itself towards the queenside, potentially to bolster the pawn chain or launch an attack on the c3 pawn. Unlocking the b6 square for the bishop. This move aims to create a pivotal outpost, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially disrupt their coordination. The monarch now seeks a safer perch, shuffling to g7, which offers a bit more breathing room from the menacing white bishop that has been eyeing the kingside. This subtle repositioning aims to bolster the king's safety, a prudent consideration given the potential for tactical skirmishes that could arise from black's somewhat passive development. While the king is now less exposed, black still needs to activate their pieces more effectively to challenge white's comfortable central control and pressure along the d-file, paving the way for the queen's knight to rejoin the fray. This maneuver subtly aims to improve white's pawn structure and potentially open a path for the rook on the c-file, while also granting the king a little more breathing room from any central action. Sensing an opportunity, black initiates a pawn thrust to gain valuable space on the kingside, potentially preparing for future pawn advances or creating a sanctuary for the king. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure is the primary goal here, preventing any immediate kingside infiltration and preparing for a potential pawn push later. Shifting the rook to c8 solidifies the c-file presence, a strategic cornerstone black has patiently cultivated, anticipating potential pawn advances or rook activity from white. Initiating a pawn offensive to seize the central dimension and create breathing room for the queen's bishop. The knight's redeployment to c6 appears to be a subtle attempt to prepare for central pawn advancement or perhaps to shore up its defensive posture in anticipation of white's potential pawn pushes. Unlocking the c-file. The bishop's presence on b6 creates a formidable pressure point, aiming to disrupt black's rook battery and potentially force concessions on the queenside. A bold territorial claim. This pawn pushes forward, aiming to disrupt white's consolidated structure and potentially create escape squares for its own king, while simultaneously limiting the mobility of white's kingside pieces. Shifting the bishop to f3 aims to reposition this piece for greater influence, potentially eyeing the kingside or supporting a pawn push, while simultaneously forcing black to reconsider the placement of their knight. Asserting presence on the critical third rank. This bishop aims to disrupt white's coordination, threatening to fork the rook and bishop if white isn't careful, while simultaneously preparing to exchange itself for the potentially annoying knight on d5. Unlocking the queenside with a rook maneuver. This advance seeks to liberate the c3 pawn and potentially initiate a pawn storm or support a later d4 push, creating interesting imbalances. Bringing the knight back into the fray offers a potential outpost on d3 and aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain. though it sacrifices some tempo by returning to a square already occupied by an enemy rook. Striking at the enemy's back rank with the bishop, White aims to disrupt Black's defensive setup and potentially isolate the rooks. This bold excursion promises to create immediate tactical complications, as the bishop now eyes vulnerable pawns and squares, forcing Black to react and potentially weakening their pawn structure further in the process. Reclaiming that knight from its advanced post is the immediate priority, preventing White's bishop pair from dominating the diagonals and opening up the A-file for potential counterplay. The rook now stands unopposed on the 7th rank, a powerful outpost that dictates much of Black's defensive strategy. Launching the rook to the 8th rank, Rg8 ** signals a proactive intent to contest the open g-file, aiming to disrupt White's established rook presence and potentially force exchanges that alleviate Black's cramped position. This maneuver, while seemingly direct, carries the subtle undertone of preparing for a potential endgame scenario where rook activity becomes paramount, offering a glimpse into Black's long-term strategic vision beyond the immediate tactical skirmishes. Pressing forward, White's pawn advances, aiming to rupture Black's pawn structure on the queenside and potentially create a passed pawn, opening up lines for the rook and potentially creating an outpost for the knight. The pawn's relentless advance now confronts Black's poorly coordinated pieces, creating a pressing spatial threat on the queenside. Unleashing the king's pawns here could be a calculated risk, aiming to pry open lines and disturb White's consolidated structure, though it leaves a potential pathway for their rook to penetrate further down the e-file. Gaining an outpost on the 7th rank with the bishop aims to disrupt Black's pawn structure and potentially force concessions. Rethinking the pawn structure, this maneuver ignites a battle for the central files and endeavors to disrupt White's attacking potential by creating counterplay on the queenside. Clearing the 7th rank, the pawn's relentless march transforms a positional advantage into a piercing threat that demands Black's immediate attention. Baffled by the bishop's relocation, Black gambles on a desperate counter-initiative, hoping the unexpected placement will disrupt White's advancing pawns and create a much-needed tactical diversion, rather than passively endure the relentless march towards the king. Liberating the bishop opens a direct confrontation, aiming to destabilize Black's tightly packed pawn structure and exploit the exposed monarch. Opening the door to the king's defense, this pawn push immediately activates the bishop and seeks to disrupt White's pawn structure. Asserting dominion over the newly opened file with the rook establishes an immediate and undeniable positional advantage, aiming to exploit the exposed Black king's precariousness and potentially generate a passed pawn on the queenside. Finally, Black decides to contest the open file, a crucial decision to prevent White's rook from dominating the 7th rank and potentially creating unstoppable passed pawns. The rook now aggressively infiltrates, aiming to exploit the pinned knight and create mating threats along the 7th rank. Shifting the king forward now, while seemingly active, risks isolating it in the center as the queens are off the board and the pawns are poised for exchange, potentially creating attacking lines for White's remaining pieces should Black miscalculate the king's safety in the upcoming pawn storm. The king seeks refuge behind a pawn shield, a pragmatic decision to avoid immediate threats and prepare for potential king activity in the upcoming endgame. Grasping at the last vestiges of activity, the Black king ventures forward, hoping to participate in the fray before the remaining pawns decide the game's fate. Capturing the opponent's rook on c8 with check definitively resolves the material imbalance created earlier. simplifying the position and leveraging the advantage gained from black's pawn sacrifice. The black rook finally recaptures the bishop, aiming to regroup in this decidedly material uneven situation. The king ventures out, initiating a delicate dance to secure the remaining pawns. The black king, having completed its journey across the board, now aims to support its remaining pawns and potentially join the fight on the queenside. Reactivating the monarch now offers a crucial injection of activity and prepares to escort the king towards the central squares for better support of the remaining pawns. The black rook endeavors to activate itself on the open e-file, seeking improved coordination with its remaining pieces and perhaps influencing the central pawn structure. The promotion of the c-pawn is the inevitable consequence of white's relentless pressure, ushering in a decisive material advantage that will likely seal the game.